Hi, I'm Jonathan Hafetz, and welcome to Law and Film, a podcast that explores the rich connections between law and film. Law is critical to many films. Film, in turn, tells us a lot about the law. In each episode, we'll examine a film that's noteworthy from a legal perspective. What legal issues does the film explore? What does it get right about the law, and what does it get wrong? And most importantly, what does the film teach us about the law and about the larger social and cultural context in which it operates? Our film today is The Sweet Hereafter, a 1997 film adapted for the screen and directed by Atom Egoyan. The film describes the impact of a tragic school bus accident that caused the death of 14 children in a small Canadian town. The film is based on Russell Banks' 1991 novel of the same name, which was in turn based on a real-life bus crash in Texas. The film centers on personal injury lawyer Mitchell Stevens, played by Ian Holm, who travels to the town from a large city after the accident in an attempt to persuade the parents of the children to bring a negligence lawsuit. The controversy generated by the lawsuit ripples through the town and is explored through several characters, including Nicole, played by Polley, the teenage girl who was left paralyzed from the waist down by the accident, Dolores Driscoll, played by Gabrielle Rose, the bus driver on that fateful day who survives with minor injuries, and various parents who have sharply conflicting views on the lawsuit. The Sweet Hereafter, however, is much more than a story about tort litigation. It explores larger philosophical questions around justice, community norms, and the role of law in addressing life's most painful tragedies. My guest to discuss The Sweet Hereafter is Seán Patrick Donlan. Seán is a professor of law at Thomas Rivers University in British Columbia, Canada, where he also served previously as associate dean. Seán's research interests include legal history, comparative law, legal theory, and Irish history and politics. Seán also teaches a law and film class in British Columbia and has previously taught this class in Ireland. And he maintains a terrific and encyclopedic law and film list on the website Letterboxd. Seán, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So the central character is Mitchell Stevens, played by Ian Holm, who comes to the town after the accident to try to unite the grieving parents in a lawsuit. What can you tell us about the context for such suits?
Well, I think they're largely the same. I should say, first of all, that I'm not an expert in the area, but I think they're largely the same as they are in the States. And so I think a lot of what is happening in the film would be very familiar to American audiences and American lawyers. The focus is on a class action related to negligent infliction of emotional harm. And as you know, I think that that's less central to the film than it might seem to be, but it certainly is the motivation in a fairly straightforward sense for the actions of Stevens in the film. There are other deeper motivations for those actions, but it's his job there, if you like.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I think you can see this kind of dual nature of the practical reality Stevens faces in trying to bring the suit and some of the larger philosophical questions in the scenes or the various scenes where Stevens is trying to sign up plaintiffs, right? He needs people to retain him in order for the suit to go forward. And in one of the scenes, Stephen goes to the home of Hartley and Wanda Otto, who have just lost their adopted son, Bear, in the accident, and he makes his pitch to them.
You're angry, aren't you, Mrs. Otto? That's why I'm here. To give your anger a voice. To be your weapon against whoever caused that bus to go off the road.
Dolores.
It's my belief that Dolores was doing exactly what she's done for years. Besides, the school board's insurance on Dolores was minimal, a few million at most. No, the really deep pockets are in the town, or the company that made the bus.
So you think someone else caused the accident, Mr. Stevens?
Mrs. Otto, there is no such thing as an accident. The word doesn't mean anything to me. As far as I'm concerned, somebody, somewhere, made a decision to cut a corner. Some corrupt agency or corporation accounted the cost variance between a 10-cent bolt and $1 million out-of-court settlement. They decided to sacrifice a few lives for the difference. That's what's done, Mrs. Otto. I've seen it happen so many times before.
But Dolores said she hit a patch of ice and lost control of the bus.
Mr. Otto, how long has Dolores been driving that bus? How many times has she steered clear of danger? I mean, what happened that morning? Somebody calculated ahead of time what it would cost to sacrifice safety. It's the darkest, most cynical thing you could imagine, but it's absolutely true. And now, they It's up to me to ensure moral responsibility in this society.
So you're just the thing we need. Isn't that what you want us to believe, Mr. Stevens? That you know what's best for us?
You listen to me, Mrs. Otto. And you listen very carefully. I do know what's best. Believe me. As we're sitting here, talking, the town, or the school board, or the manufacturer of that bus are lining up a battery of their own lawyers to negotiate with people as grief-stricken as yourselves. And that makes me very, very mad. That's why I came all the way up here. If everyone had done their job with integrity, your son would be alive and safely in school this morning. I promise that I will pursue and reveal who it was did not do their job, who was responsible for this tragedy. And then in your name, in Walker's name, in the name of whoever decides to join us, I will sue. I will sue for negligence until they bleed.
I want the person to go to jail for the rest of his life. I don't want it.
It's unlikely that anyone will go to prison, Mrs. Otto. But he or his company will pay in other ways. And we must make them pay. Not for the money or for the compensation for the loss of your boy, that can be done, but for the protection of other innocent children.
What does this scene suggest to you about Stevens' approach and the challenges he faces and his view that there is no such thing as an accident?
Right. I do think the scene is critical. It's maybe the most critical in the film, but in part that's because we hear all the worst, if you like, of the ambulance chaser. We hear somebody who's talking about representing the families, not in their grief, they can't help them with that, but in their anger and directing that anger. He says he knows what's best and that his job is to, I forget the exact quote, but to tend to the moral community, something of that sort. And that he's very, very mad, very angry, that he'll sue for negligence until they bleed, which brings to mind other threats we'll talk about later made to him. But it also says, and I think this is often lost in the legal commentary, it also says that he knows that winning the lawsuit for the families is not going to put things right. It can't be enough. It can't compensate for their loss. And he makes very explicit in both the film and in the novel. Maybe I'll say a thing or two about the novel in just a moment. Well, maybe I'll say that now. I mean, my reading of the film might be very different if I hadn't made the choice, maybe the mistake, to read the novel, because it so informs and complicates the film that I find it impossible to separate the two at this point. But in both the film and in more detail in the novel, he says very clearly that what he's trying to do is protect children for the future. And in fact, in the novel, Wanda is pregnant. I don't think she's pregnant in the film. So it's not abstract or hypothetical, at least in his mind. I think it's quite straightforward, practical, and I think sincere. Again, I think that's often been missed by some of the legal analysis of the film. But there's little reason to think that for all the performance he puts on as a lawyer, that he's not actually sincere. And we see a lot of his relationship with his daughter in the film. And again, I think there's little to suggest that he was a bad parent or that he did anything particularly wrong and that he doesn't genuinely love his daughter. But that comes through repeatedly in the film in a number of ways.
It's really interesting, even though he's viewed as sort of, in some of the commentaries, an ambulance chaser, and profit doesn't seem to be what's motivating him. There's a lot of personal things that are going on that are driving Stevens, and I think it really complicates the picture.
Well, sure. And I think and there are lots of parallels as well between different characters in the film, especially parents and children. That's true about Stevens and his daughter Zoe, Sam and Nicole, who we'll talk about obviously later, but also Billy and his children. It may well be that Stevens is living a fairly nice existence, but he's also, again, tending to his daughter and flying here and there to take care of her, to rescue her, and no doubt to give her money. And so his making the money by ambulance chasing itself serves a practical and arguably moral function. Again, I think that sort of thing will come up as well with other parents in the film, maybe particularly with Sam and Nicole, but I know we'll get to that.
Absolutely. And just to kind of dwell on the scene a little bit between Hartley and Wanda Otto and Stevens, one of the commentaries by Professor Timothy P. O'Neill, who draws on the legal philosopher Judith Shklar's distinction between misfortune and injustice. And I think this idea reverberates throughout the film. So referencing Shklar, O'Neill writes, a misfortune is a dreadful event that's caused by external forces of nature because it could not be prevented. People must resign themselves to their suffering. An injustice, on the other hand, is a disaster brought about by human agency because it could have been prevented. People express outrage, assign blame, and seek relief. Do you think this is a helpful lens to kind of view the film and the themes it explores, this tension between misfortune, kind of a divine act or an act of fate, and an injustice, something that's caused in whole or in part by human beings and warrants some kind of remedy?
Oh, absolutely. There's no question, and it's central to both again the novel and to the film. I think it is interesting because in the novel there is far more complexity, I think, about what has happened. And I mean, it starts off with the bus driver talking about her recollections and how they are unclear, and she doesn't quite know what happened, even if we don't think that she's at fault in the novel either. Whereas in the film, which changes a number of things with respect to the bus driver, but all we really hear about is an ice patch. And when we see the accident happen, we see it from afar. We don't really see anything inside the bus or that might explain what happened. In the novel, there's a mention of the possibility that there was a dog at the moment that it happened, as well as the ice and so on. That's not clear in the film. But I do think that that distinction is critical. I think it's also obviously been one that's been important to legal analysis of the film. Mitchell says, or Stevens says rather, that there's no such thing as an accident. It's interesting early in the film, when the film begins, and it's something that Egoyan added to the novel, Stevens is stuck in a car wash. And at the same time, he's trying to communicate with his daughter. So there's all sorts of complexity there about communication problems with his daughter, with problems in movement across space as well. But he also says, while he's caught in the car wash, he says, I've had an accident. He's calling someone to try to get him out. And ironically, it's not an accident. I mean, almost certainly something, God didn't do it. Something went wrong mechanically, and he gets stuck and he has to climb out of the car while the car wash is running. But I think the distinction is important. And as we'll talk about, Billy in particular, but others who try to conceptualize what happened as misfortune, an act of God, it is problematic because the only way to know that something is a misfortune is, in fact, to investigate whether or not there's an explanation. And so, in many ways, and again, I know we'll get to it, but Billy aborts that or attempts to abort that discussion, and Nicole's lies ensure that it doesn't happen. And so, we don't actually know what occurred. So it might appear to be a misfortune or an act of God, but we don't know because the seriousness of the situation hasn't been such that an investigation has been carried out that would determine whether or not something happened that would explain it. So we don't know. And to some extent, it is fair to say Stevens' personal vendetta is he's chancing his arm. He's hoping that there's some explanation. There may not be, but we don't know unless that investigation occurs and it's aborted by the actions, again, of Billy and others.
It's interesting how Stevens frames that. His view is there's no such thing as an accident, right? And I think he references a couple possible causes. Maybe the bus was faulty. There was a mechanical problem in the bus. The guardrail wasn't strong enough. But in any event, there's been a grievous harm, and his job is to kind of move forward. He does reference, though, that the town and the bus company, they've all got lawyers. We don't see that. We don't see the lawyer for the other side until the end when we have Nicole's deposition and the kind of climactic moment, which we'll talk about later in the podcast. But there is a sense where Stevens is trying to move forward and to affix liability to someone with the deep pockets, school, the town, or the bus company. And Stevens just says, I think when he's talking to some of the parents and maybe Nicole, that he's just doing his job, right? This is what he's supposed to do, and that everyone else is doing their job. So there is that element of it as well.
Well, absolutely. Again, because there aren't deep pockets there, the city and the others are simply likely to pay and have done with it to move on. And certainly Billy's role is a complicated one. I think people have read his actions in the film and maybe in the book to a lesser extent as a defensive community and trying to shield the community from Stevens and this ambulance chaser. I think that's reading a lot into what's going on. Billy's defense of community, both in the film but also in the novel, where it is a richer thing, is, I suggest, largely about his own attempt to move on from what's happened. In the film, it's hinted at. In the novel, there's more discussion, but he's lost his wife not long before this. Now he's lost his children. In the novel in particular, he turns to drink and he simply wants to get away from the situation. there isn't really an articulated defensive community. He says, I want to help you out. That's what we used to do. This was a community, something like that at the end. But it's more rhetorical than real. And Billy also has things to protect as well in terms of secrets from an investigation. There's the sort of standard small town trope of hidden secrets that are exposed by an outsider, and Billy's fighting against that as much as anything communitarian. He's defending perhaps himself. He is having an affair with another character in the film. He's talking to her, and in fact, in the novel, thinking of sex at the moment that the bus crash occurs. There's a lot that he's dealing with, but there's much less of a reasoned, elaborate defensive community than I think some people have suggested. And there are other nuances and complexities with respect to Billy. His relationship to Nicole is a complicated one.
Yeah, Billy Ansell, played by Bruce Greenwood, is an important and critical character. And I think, as you're saying, that maybe more in the film than in the book is viewed as the sort of voice of the community in opposition to the lawsuit. It's a more complicated picture than legal commentators have suggested. But in the film, there are a couple of scenes, right, where Billy says we need to rely on the community rather than lawyers, right? In one scene, he confronts very angrily Stevens, right? Stevens is looking at night. He's gone to look at the bus, the remains of the bus, to kind of do an investigation to look at the bus that was involved in the crash. Stevens finds him. He confronts him. There's some angry words exchanged.
I'm here about your children, Mr. Ansell. My name is...
Mister, I don't want to know your name.
I understand.
No, you don't. Get the fuck away from the bus.
I can help you.
Not unless you can raise the dead. Mitchell Stevens, Esquire. Tell me, would you be likely to sue me if I was to beat you right now? I mean, beat you so bad you pissed blood and couldn't walk for a month. Because that's what I'm about to do.
No, Mr. Ansell. I'm going to sue you.
You leave us alone, Stevens. You leave the people of this town alone. You can't help.
You can help each other.
In another scene, Billy visits Sam, who's Nicole's father, at his house and warns him about the dangers of the lawsuit and urges him not to support it. And you can see the tension between Billy and Sam in this exchange, and Sam's desire to keep going with the lawsuit. Basically says he needs the money.
What brings you out tonight?
Well, I might as well tell you the truth, Sam. It's about this lawsuit that you got yourself all involved with. Well, I'd like you to drop the damn thing.
I don't see how that concerns you, Billy.
Well, it does concern me.
Don't know why I should. That's why a lot of people in this town have got involved with lawsuits. We're hardly unique here, Billy.
You know, if you two drop the case, then the others are going to come to their senses and they'll follow you. You're good, sensible parents, you and Mary. People respect you.
No, Billy. We can't drop the lawsuit. I mean, you know how much we need the money.
Why? You got the money from Dolores' insurance with the school board. We all did.
It's not enough. And for the hospital bills for Nicole.
Well, I'll help you pay for Nicole if that's what you're really talking about. I'll even give you the money I got for my kids. That's what we used to do, remember? Help each other, because this was a community.
But as you also say, Billy does have some other motives, including to try to keep his extramarital affair potentially out of the situation that might get exposed if he was part of litigation, as he was on the phone with Risa, who he's having the affair with before the accident. And right, Billy is, of course, driving behind the bus, right? He follows the bus every day, the school bus every day, because his children sit in the back and he waves at them and sees them. So he sees the bus go off the road. He's a direct witness to the accident. And as you suggested, he doesn't want to have to go through this again. He's going to get subpoenaed. The other lawyers are going to then require him to talk, and he just wants the whole thing to go away.
So stay out of it.
Well, I've tried to stay out of it. Sam, turns out that's not so easy. You've gone and got yourself this lawyer, Mitchell Stevens.
So? I mean, lots of folks got lawyers.
But he's the one who's going to subpoena me, Sam. He's going to force me to testify in court. He came by the garage this afternoon. Gave me that slip of paper.
Why would he do that? I mean, you didn't have anything to do with the accident.
Because I was driving behind the bus. I saw it happen. Now, if that son of a bitch does subpoena me, if he forces me to go over all this again, then all those other lawyers are going to line up behind him and try and do the same thing.
Do you think the film does, though, try to really use Billy to kind of set up this conflict between law and community?
I think that's there. I think it's more incidental than central in the sense that it may be that the idea, again, of misfortune and injustice is more central, whatever about the law. And certainly in the novel, and I was reminding myself of this last night, looking at it again, he does talk at some length about how people want to assign blame and they want to assign it here and here and here and here and here. And that's not appropriate. I suppose what's unclear is why it's not appropriate or why he treats it as something that's not rational. When I think a better reading or more likely reading both of the film and the novel is that Billy, again, is simply fleeing. He's paralyzed by the losses, the number of losses he's faced. There are a number of shots in the film of Stevens and his family, and some of the most poetic elements of the film are in those shots. But Billy gets some attention too in that respect. And we see, I think it's the only flashback probably of any of the victims. We see his wife with the children before her death. And it's something that's barely mentioned in the film, but it's lovely. Billy was there when the crash happened. We see him identifying the victims on site. You know, he's suffered a massive loss. What's interesting is in the confrontation, because it is a confrontation with Stevens. And maybe I should say that one of the nice things about the film and complicating things about the film is that it is told with multiple nonlinear narratives. And that's a feature of Egoyan's work. And it's an interesting way to handle a novel that itself is a series of monologues by different characters. But the confrontation with Stevens, Billy and Stevens has been looking at the bus. He's filming the bus, and there's some interesting shots again where the windows of the bus look like teeth of a monster or something. It's pretty dark stuff. He sees Billy approaching, and he hides behind a sign, possibly because he doesn't know what's about to happen. But then when Billy confronts him, and again, it's more an anger than an argument, he tells him he will beat him until he bleeds. Again, words that are similar to what Stevens says he will do. You know, they both have anger. They both have anger because of the loss, the different types of losses that they've suffered with their children. And I suppose what I think is critical to both the film and the novel, and understandably, the novel has more room to articulate. But at the end of that confrontation, Stevens starts talking about how we've all lost our children. It's not particularly lengthy, but Billy leaves. And Stevens is still speaking to thin air. It's very theatrical in a sense.
Why am I telling you this, Mr. Edsel? Because we've all lost our children. They're dead to us. They're killing each other in the streets. They wander comatose to shopping malls. Something terrible has happened. It's taken our children away.
It's a shorter version of what's very lengthy or substantial in the book. And it's about how we've all lost our children to violence, to drugs, to possibly to Vietnam, to divorce, to TV. And in fact, he says in the novel that the best we can do for them and for ourselves is rage against what took them. Although we don't quite know what took them. That's clear. So in short, the loss of the children in the crash in the film is just the most explicit harm suffered by, if you like, modern parents. Stephen's loss of his daughter to drugs, and there's a hint of porn and other things, is no less real. It's another negligent infliction of emotional harm without a clear cause, either in law or reality. And so it is central. When Billy later on does visit Nicole and her family, yeah, he does argue that, we need to let this go. I'll help you. But again, I don't think it's particularly rich. And ironically, or maybe not ironically, but when Sam, the father, speaks to Billy as he leaves, basically Sam is saying, and Sam is by no means a moral model in the film, but he basically says, we're all trying to get on with things. Billy, you need to do the same. And I don't know that he's wrong in the context of the film.
I want to go back for a second to the aftermath of the scene with Stevens and Billy. The angry confrontation, as you said, it then moves to a monologue by Stevens about children and how we've all lost our children. Like during the scene, as actually during multiple scenes, when Stevens is talking to the parents and trying to sign them up for the lawsuit, his daughter calls. There's another anguished cry for help or for money for his daughter who's lost a drug addiction, right? And he's interrupted almost by he has to take the call, right, and deal with that. And so it happens during the confrontation with Billy, and Billy says, why are you telling me this? But in any event, right after the confrontation ends, his daughter, Stevens' daughter Zoe, calls Stevens back. Stevens takes the call, and she reveals some additional information. Zoe has just told him that she now has AIDS, which at the time the film was made or set was basically like a death sentence.
Collect call from Zoe. Will you accept the charges?
Daddy?
Yes.
I'm calling because I've got some news for you, Daddy. Some big news.
News?
Don't you want to hear?
Yes, give me the news, Zoe.
You always think you know what I'm going to say before I say it, don't you, Daddy? You always think you're one step ahead of me, the lawyer. Yesterday, I went to sell my blood. They wouldn't take my blood. Do you know what that means, Daddy? Does it register? I tested positive. Welcome to hard times, Daddy.
I think this goes to your point, just sort of intensifying this larger theme about parents and children and grief and loss.
That's right. And again, the novel is set in 1991. Things were probably even worse at that point. And it's even more explicit in the book, again, that it's AIDS. In the film a few years later, I don't know the state of medicine at the time, but I think it was largely a death sentence. And he's finding out at the same time he's visiting the community. There are a number of changes to the story for the film. And one of them is a flight that Stevens is taking in the film that's set 2 years after the events of the film. And he meets a childhood friend, Zoe, his daughter. And so there's an opportunity as a result for him to say a lot of things that would otherwise be very difficult to explain in the film. But he's going to rescue her again. And so it's unclear what's happening there. And I think maybe that's intentional. He talks about going to rescue Zoe again. We don't know if, in fact, she was lying earlier about having AIDS. It's unlikely given the way it was presented to us, but it's not impossible. But he's going to rescue her yet again. And while in the novel, he talks about her revelation that she has AIDS as a moment of truth, because he will know whether she's lying or not, where he doesn't know much of the time. Both in the book and in the film, he still pledges that he will do whatever it takes. And so it is an important thing for him to know whether it's true or not. And I think we need to remember that in terms of what he's doing with the community as well. He actually does want truth, I think, even if his motivations are anger and loss. But even if he knew that his daughter, in fact, had been lying to him about AIDS, he would continue to support her at great personal and financial cost.
I think some of the ironies too, the painful ironies that come through in the scenes on the airplane where he's talking to Zoe's friend of the family, who's doing, clearly quite well. And there's a lot of these kind of flashbacks or discussions, at least one flashback to a scene where Zoe was 3 at the time and they were up at a cottage somewhere and she had been, it turns out, bitten by, there's like a nest of black widow spiders under the mattress and she'd been bitten and they have to get her to the hospital. It's like 40 minutes away. And when they call the doctor says, hopefully you'll make it, try to keep her calm. But if she stops breathing, you're going to have to basically perform a tracheotomy. And it cuts to this really poignant scene where they're driving and Zoe, like age 3 or whatever, is looking up and you see her looking into Stephen's eye and you see that knife that he has ready to go in case she stops breathing. But it really suggests the sacrifices he would make and the love and also kind of like what happened and what went wrong, just like what went wrong for all those parents. So I think it's a really kind of powerful addition to the film.
I agree. And the story itself is in the novel, but the way it's presented in the film is, again, for lack of a better word, poetic. In fact, the film starts with images. It's not clear to us what's going on initially, but it's that flashback to the point where she was 3. It's, a very young couple and this 3-year-old daughter. And there's something universal and timeless about the image. It's almost nativity-like, in fact. But the story comes up later. He tells it to Allison on the plane. Yeah, they're flying first class, so she must have done well enough. And explains, as you say, rightly, that he was 2 people in that situation. He was the loving father who was singing nursery rhymes and songs to the daughter to keep her calm because she didn't know what was going on. And at the same time, he was ready to cut her throat open for the tracheotomy, if necessary, with all the pain, both for the child and the parents, that would have involved. And I do think it is central to the film. And little touches, when he finishes telling the story, he's in a bit of a trance. And it sounds theatrical. It's not actually in the film, but he touches his throat. And he's clearly still hurting very deeply about this daughter who is not dead, who is alive, but who is dead to him in many ways.
I want to talk about Nicole for a minute. I think probably the climactic moment of the film, at least from a plot perspective and possibly an emotional perspective as well. There's so many great emotional moments in the film where Nicole is giving the deposition, right? Stevens wants her to go last in the series of depositions. So she was this teenage girl, very talented musician who's paralyzed from the waist down in the accident, right? And so she goes to her deposition. At that point, it's like this painful scene of her father, Sam, it's also revealed she had an incestuous relationship with, is now kind of carrying her from the car up the steps to the room where they're going to do the deposition. And she's the critical witness. And she doesn't like the lawsuit. She made that clear. She's reservations. She expressed those reservations earlier when Billy and her father, Sam, had the altercation about the suit. But she says, I'm going to tell the truth. And so she starts to testify and she lies.
Well then, now that your memory seems to be clearing, can you tell us what else you observed at that time?
I was scared.
Why were you scared? This is before the accident, Nicole. You understand what I'm asking?
Yes, I understand.
Why were you scared?
Dolores was driving too fast.
Mrs. Driscoll was driving too fast. What made you think that, Nicole?
The speedometer. It was downhill there.
You could see the speedometer.
Yes. I looked. I remember clearly now. It seemed we were going too fast down the hill, and I was scared.
How fast would you say Mrs. Driscoll was going, to the best of your recollection?
72 miles an hour.
72 miles an hour. You're sure of this?
Positive.
So you believe the bus driven by Mrs. Driscoll was traveling at 72 miles an hour at this time?
Told you I was positive. The speedometer was large and easy to read from where I was.
You saw the speedometer?
Yes.
Did you say anything to Mrs. Driscoll?
No.
Why not?
Because I was scared. And there wasn't time.
There wasn't time?
No. Because the bus went off the road and crashed.
You remember this?
Yes. I do now. Now that I'm telling you.
And so after Nicole provides her testimony, it's clear that the suit's over. Dolores does not have deep pockets, and basically there's no liability, no blame that could be affixed on anyone else. So why does Nicole lie? What do you make of her motives and the kind of significance of her likely altering the reality of what happened?
If I could step back, first of all, to say that the young Nicole is played by a young Sarah Polley. I haven't lived in the States for some time now, but Sarah Polley is very well known in Canada and I think well known globally. But at this point, more as a director than an actress. And she did a lot of acting as a young person. This was an important role, but she's directed a number of films as well, including one that is a documentary about her own complicated relationship with her, I'll say, fathers, to leave it open for anyone who wants to explore. But also she wrote a film, adapted a film herself called Women Talking. And again, ironic is not the right word, but given the importance of talking in the film and how it's important that we talk is something that Mitchell says, or Stephen says a number of times. But Women Talking was itself based very loosely on a real event and is a very good film. I would strongly encourage people see. So Sarah Polley is well known, and part of her reputation is from this film. But there's a complicated story here between Nicole and her father, Sam. And when we're introduced to Nicole, she's singing at fairground, sort of state fair type thing in the States. And we see somebody admiring the singing. It's not clear what his age is, could be the boyfriend, it's hard to know. And then we realize it's her father. And at the time, it's like, oh, that's sweet. What a loving family. And he's very supportive. And there is a little clue. I didn't notice this myself for a while, but there are references to the children as animals, not in a negative sense, but a sort of innocent sense by Dolores. In the first scene where Sam and Nicole are walking off in one direction, there's a farmer leading a cow or a calf by rope in the other. And I can't imagine that's accidental, the coincidental. But we later discover, again, there are complications here with the relationship with Billy. I'll get back to in a moment. But we see Nicole's father pick her up from babysitting for Billy, and they get home, and there's a hesitation, absolutely, but it's not clear what it means. And then there's a cut to a scene in a hayloft with lots of candles around, which itself is pretty strange. And the two, Sam and Nicole, are in what is clearly a romantic or sexual situation. And at least in that scene, she kisses him rather than the other way around. I have heard that this is supposed to be her imagining of the scene. It's in part, you can imagine so many candles would not make a lot of sense in a hayloft. But even so, it's her imagining of this event and suggests something of the complexity of feelings that she must have had. So we know that that's happened. And then when the accident occurs and she's paralyzed, one of the lines that is well known in the film is she's a wheelchair girl now. Her father prepares the room in a very gaudy princess style. There's discussion about how he's painted the ramp red and then she wants it green or something like that. I can't remember exactly. But it is true that she's clearly angry about the situation in general. And, there's some talk about locks in the room and different things like that. But Billy's visit and what she overhears does seem to convince her, both in the novel and in the film, to take the opportunity to lie. And the way that's presented by a number of people, and I'm not saying it's wrong, and it certainly represents a larger number of the people, maybe on, if you like, on my side of the reading, but is that in her lying at the end, that she's taking revenge on her father and getting her own back in some sense. It's I've seen things that make it sound transformative, and I think that the director clearly, he says as much in an interview I heard, but he clearly had his thumb very aggressively on the scale here. And the final scene is one where that idea that it's transformative and triumphant is hard to miss, even if it's in fact really complicated under the surface. So the complexities with Billy are numerous. First of all, and we haven't really talked about it, but there is the introduction to the film of the Pied Piper narrative. And we see her initially with the children, Billy's children, reading the Pied Piper. And a lot of people like that. And I do think it contributes to the poetic aspects of the film. The music to the film is almost medieval. Certainly that's intentional. I think the story actually complicates the film in ways that are problematic. But we see her taking care of the children. But we also see her playing dress up, in effect, with the clothes of Billy's widow. And again, from the dialogue in the film, we know that he must have said to do that. It was okay. She wasn't simply doing it. But there's an odd conversation when he returns about how his wife would have given clothes to her anyway when she outgrew them. And Nicole even says, outgrew them, like she's an adult woman. And there's this odd tension in that scene where Billy clearly is also remembering the loss of his wife, but where he's treating his wife, if you like, as a young person. He's got this young person in front of him. This is just before the scene with Nicole and Sam, her father, that is incestuous. But she takes some of the clothes. She's wearing some of the clothes during the crash. And in fact, both in the novel and the film, Riza, who's the character that Billy's having an affair with, suggests that may have in somehow way caused the accident. But there's this strange sense in which she's playing mother to the children. She's wearing the wife's clothes. And when Billy does visit her family and makes his argument, and Nicole changes her mind about what she's going to do, there is a sense in which it's more of the action of a jilted lover than of an angry daughter. I don't mean to suggest that they're mutually exclusive. And certainly in the book especially, it's clear that she was suicidal. Her situation was very dark in a way that we don't see as much in the film, although we can imagine. All of which is to say, I think that her motives for lying, again, are not necessarily to defend the community or to hurt her father, but are more complicated. One other note, and one of the things that's interesting about the film being set in Canada, is that some of the medical concerns would be less intense than they would be, of course, in the States. But there is a sense in which Sam, for all his twisted motives, may actually have been concerned about finances. And the fact that they don't get an award hurts not Sam as much as it hurts Nicole. And so it seems to me a very blunt response to the incestuous relationship. Now, having said that, it occurred to me that there are a number of films, especially maybe that focus on women, where other mechanisms don't exist to object, to change things, that more violent responses might be, if not okay, understandable. There's a film called A Question of Silence set in the Netherlands that is similar, where three women kill somebody in a shop who's just been unpleasant to them. Did he deserve it? No, but the suggestion is that the system is such that they finally snapped. And, we could talk about Thelma and Louise and a lot of other films. So Nicole's responses don't need to be rational to be understandable. But what she does in the end is she takes out another victim, a woman, who is completely innocent, as far as we know, and who is the most community-oriented of anyone in the film. Dolores is played by Gabrielle Rose, who is from the town I now live in, but she suffers. And it's a big part of the novel as well that's left out of the film.
I think that's really critical, that discrepancy between the book and the novel. And the film doesn't grapple with the consequences for Dolores, or it does, but it kind of elides them by not really showing what could have happened, right? You have, legal scholar like Carrie Michael-Meadow and others praising Nicole's decision to lie as telling her own truth, right? And as you said, she has her own motives and there's something affirming about it. It may be somewhat irrational in a sense that there's not enough money for her. At the end, there's a scene in the car between her and her father after it happens where she says, Mr. Stevens is going to let me keep my computer, But for her, it's very, kind of affirming. She's very clear about what she's doing, but blame is finally affixed. And it's affixed, as you said, on Dolores, the bus driver, the community-minded woman who's just torn up with grief for being, in some sense, the agent for the death of these children who she had in her care because Nicole says Dolores was speeding, driving recklessly. And so the film just doesn't talk about what the impact of that was on Dolores. And the book does, though, right? The book does talk about the impact of Nicole's lie on Dolores. She's kind of shunned by the other people in the town. They don't want anything to do with her. They're not going to acknowledge her. They won't give her assistance when she runs into them at the demolition derby, at the annual race that they have with her husband. They won't give her assistance with her husband, Abbott, who's disabled in a wheelchair because he had a stroke. So earlier, like the film has Dolores sort of saying, basically channeling her husband when Stevens comes and visits them, I don't want to be judged by a jury of strangers.
You heard what Abbott said. Abbott said the true jury of a person's peers is the people of her town. Only they, the people who have known her all her life, and not 12 strangers, can decide her guilt or innocence.
But the book suggests the jury of her peers judged her harshly because of the lie. So there's a real tension, I think, between some of the accounts of what Nicole does in terms of the impact on Dolores.
It's a line from the book, but it's not one that would have been surprising in the film. And of course, as you say, Abbott had a stroke. One of the ways in which Dolores is a lovely, caring person is she's taking care of her disabled husband, who is likely a veteran, by the way. There's a little Canadian symbol on his his fleece that suggests that he's a veteran as well, but he can't communicate in a clear way, but she seems to understand him. But what he says in the book is that blame creates comprehension. It's not a startling phrase given what we've already talked about. But in this case, blame is not about finding a way to, for example, discover that railing wasn't sufficiently strong, in that area with that speed limit and so on. Blame means scapegoating. In casual conversation, we know what it means, but it's something that goes back to the Old Testament, to the Torah, and to the idea of an animal, a goat, being sacrificed for the sins of the community, or carrying the sins of the community as it's released off into the desert to die. And Dolores is the person here who's scapegoated and sacrificed. And as you say in the novel, the entire final chapter is about Dolores's discovery in the aftermath of the lie, what's happened. And she doesn't know when she arrives at this demolition derby, which is interesting in itself because the demolition derby is apparently what Abbott loves to see at the fair. And it's an old car of hers that's in the demolition derby. And so she realizes, watching as people are cheering the car being pummeled, actually Billy's there, drunk, and Billy reveals to Dolores that Nicole has lied, and she's stunned. The first part of the chapter, she talks about how the community is her family. It's the most important thing to her. And by the end of the chapter, she realizes that the community has let her go. They've let her go on the basis of a lie. They've scapegoated her. It is not uncomplicated because the car wins, I think, the demolition derby. And even that is something that everyone cheers. So maybe surviving the scapegoating is important too. But she's very seriously harmed by what Nicole has done. In the film, we see Stevens 2 years later when he's going to visit Zoe again. He's on the flight and so on. He sees her working in an airport. So she's driving a bus there. And I would say she smiles exactly, but she's not unpleasant either. And she doesn't, shake her fist or anything. But she's clearly no longer in a community. She's working at an airport and ostracized from the community, which she felt so much a part of. And, she's got to pay Abbott's bills too. Again, Canada, less of a concern, but in upstate New York, it might have been very serious for her to have lost her job and lost the opportunity to find a way to be compensated for the accident herself.
I thought the film ends with the shot, right? So this is Stevens after this long flight where he's met Zoe's childhood friend. He's talked to Allison, has gone back through his past. He gets off, he's getting into his car, he puts his luggage in, he sees Dolores ushering these passengers onto the airport shuttle. She runs, and she's kind of now in a new role that's different, but similar to the role she played before. I read it as something of a not unhappy ending for Dolores. And the film, I didn't get a sense of ostracization so much as she kind of moved on and found some separate peace, if you will, as opposed to kind of the more direct ostracization that she faces in the book.
I agree that may be true, and it may be what the director intended as well. And again, there's so much more in the novel. But remember, she talks about the children of her town. She's very community oriented. She's working at an airport, so yes, she's caring for those people, but she has no relationship with those people and can't. They're transient. She'll bring them somewhere and they'll fly out the next day. So she's lost that connection to her community, that sense of family, as she mentions in the book, that she had. But it may be a way of softening, dampening what happens in the film. I agree with you there.
I think it's an example of what Nicole talks about in the final words of living in the sweet hereafter, this kind of bittersweet place, which we can talk a little about in a second when we sum up. But it's interesting about the blame because some of the critics that we talked about of the film and view it as a critique of law and ambulance chasers. Austin Sarrett has written things like this, critical of civil law's attempt to turn a misfortune into a justice through a process of naming, claiming, and blaming. In the end, there is blame assigned, right? It's almost like in the book anyway, right? There is someone that's blamed. It's almost like, and I think this has been written about, something like the lottery, like Shirley Jackson's book, where someone does have to take the blame and it is Dolores. So I think that's to me, a significant difference between the two in terms of the impact of Nicole's lie. Like you said, it's a separate chapter in the book.
I do think that just as the idea that we've all lost our children that Stevens mentions earlier, this idea, the fact of scapegoating, not just a blame again of scapegoating, is something that's central to the novel, is less central to the film. Egoyan made a lot of changes to the text and was nominated for Best Adapted Screenplay. Again, in addition to reading the novel and that complicating my reading, I found a screenplay online that I thought was the screenplay for the film and discovered it was an earlier screenplay. It may have been the shooting script, but not the final script. And there's a lot that was taken out, and most of it for the better because it's pretty heavy-handed. And it's clear, even in interviews, that Egoyan has said that the film was about two things. It's about the loss, the community's loss of the children, and Nicole. And so he moves her very much to the center. There are scenes where the song Courage, nothing subtle about that, is played as she acts. And then in the final part of the film, which again it probably actually doesn't exist in real time. It probably is a dreamlike sequence, but it's a earlier period where she's caring for the kids. She's, I guess, closing the book, the Pied Piper narrative that was added by Egoyan to the film, to the story. And I guess she kisses the kids goodnight. I don't know if that means anything. It might. But she walks out and we see her framed at windows in the house by lights. I mean, logically, if that occurred earlier in the film, it's actually Billy coming home, but she's illuminated by the glow. There is also the possibility, of course, that it's somehow her father arriving as well and the dangers of that. But it is this, again, beautiful final scene that is actually difficult, I think, to make a lot of sense of, but nevertheless lovely and poetic, and no doubt part of what is attractive about the film. I doubt that most viewers of the film see this film or most films in the same way maybe you or I do, where it's important to sort those things out as best we can.
So, Seán, can you talk just a little bit more about the director, Atom Egoyan? This is, I think, such an amazing film. Also, some of the decisions he made or other decisions he made in adapting Russell Banks's novel.
Sure. I mean, Egoyan, it's interesting. He was born in Egypt. He was the son of Armenian Egyptian parents. And my understanding is that they named him Atom because of a nuclear plant that was being built in Egypt. So it's not an Armenian name. There's not another explanation. It's a curious name. But he moved to British Columbia when he was 2 and grew up here. And the film is, I think, still his best known work. He was nominated for Academy Awards for Best Director and Best Adapted Screenplay. And he adapted it from a Russell Banks novel. We've talked about how it was set in upstate New York. And that was inspired, the novel was inspired by a similar tragedy in Texas in the 1980s. And in that crash in Texas, I think it was Alton, Texas, the lawyers certainly behaved very badly and swarmed in all the worst stereotypes of ambulance chasing. But in terms of the film and the novel, Egoyan makes a number of changes. We've mentioned, and I'll say more in a minute, I think, about the Pied Piper, the introduction of that poem. Maybe I should also say that Banks was around, is my understanding, during the filming. And Banks, in fact, plays a character in the film. Banks is the doctor who speaks to Nicole briefly in the film. And I wish I knew more about Banks as a writer, too, to better understand the themes of his book and how they translate to the film. But Egoyan adds the Pied Piper poem, and as I said, the music in the film is influenced by that choice as well. Egoyan added the images of the young Stevens family, and beautiful images that are important to, I think, the appreciation people have for the film. Egoyan adds Stevens' flight to Zoe 2 years after the events of the film. He moves it to Canada, although it may be that was practical. It may be financial in some sense, but it also has some curious effects. As I've said, the situation would be different. The concerns about medical care would be different in Canada than they would be in the States. And there were a number of little quirks as a result of that. The film talks about miles per hour rather than kilometers, things like that. And as we said, the film omits the last final chapter with Dolores, focusing on the consequences of Nicole's lies. But the Pied Piper, it is interesting. And there's a I don't know, ancient is the right word, but a very old legend that tells of a town that engages a Pied Piper to rid their town of rats. And then they refuse to pay the Pied Piper. And so he leads the children away. And in the version, in the Robert Browning version from the mid 19th century that we get here, into a mountain, and they disappear forever. And it is poetic. And it's one of those things I think if you don't explore deeply is lovely about the film. And you walk away thinking, what a nice addition. I think if you explore it, it becomes very complicated and problematic. Who is the Pied Piper? Well, the obvious choice is it's Stevens. But again, I think if we understand Stevens' character, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And there are other possibilities. Dolores makes comments that make her sound like she's plucking the children, like berries. And so, maybe she's the Pied Piper. But I think ultimately there is no Pied Piper because it's not part of the story. It's something that's been introduced by the director, and I think somewhat imperfectly, although I should say, because I know I have been critical at times, I think it's a fantastic film, and I would encourage anyone to watch it. But I would also encourage people to read the book if they're so inclined. There is one other interesting element, for me at least, about the Pied Piper, and that is there are a number of ways in which in the novel there are hints at something fairy tale-like or something beyond the ordinary reality about this community as well. And twice in the book, Stevens refers to the entering the community as entering the forest primeval. And it's funny because I knew that phrase, but I couldn't remember what it's from until literally this morning when I looked it up again. And it's from, of all things, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's Evangeline, which is about the expulsion of the Acadians out of Canada and to, among other places, my Louisiana. It was interesting to see that it was that connection. But certainly the way the film is shot in many ways, elements both in the novel and the film, create this as not just a very real event that was horrific for all involved, but as something more timeless as well. And again, even I was critical a moment ago about the final scene and the light and so on, but I think that contributes to it as well. And I think it probably will be a strength of the film into the future. There's a lot that we can do with audio clips and talk, but people have to see the film as well. And it is a lovely film, beautifully shot, and that's very much a part of its appeal, and quite rightly.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, we talk about some of the differences and choices Egoyan made in adapting the novel, but I think the film really does just stand on its own as just a supreme piece of filmmaking. And having watched it twice again, preparing for the podcast, each time you really notice different things and sort of mysteries that start to unravel themselves or just that remain as mysteries, the ambiguity of the Pied Piper and what its meaning is and how it interacts with the film. I don't think there's a clear answer, but I do think it adds some dimension. And the idea of treating the film as something of a fairy tale with no clear interpretation. One other note just before we wrap up on Egoyan, he also cast his wife in the film. His wife, Arsene Kanjian, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, plays Wanda Otto, one of the grief-stricken parents, and she's in a lot of his films. So
that's right. And first of all, she's also Armenian Canadian, I think, and that's part of what their connection was. I think they met in a university. But in addition, she recommended the book to him, to Egoyan as well. So it's because of her that he ended up adapting the book and making the film.
So the inverse of blame being credit. So
That's right.
Credit goes to her, for otherwise we wouldn't have this amazing film. And I think, as you said, there's lessons in there about personal injury law and some of the dynamics, but it's really much more kind of a meditation about larger themes that are connected to the law of blame and responsibility and grief and healing. It's just a great film. Well, thanks so much, Seán. It's been great having you on to talk about this and to share all your insights and knowledge about the movie and the book with me on the podcast.
Thank you. It's been fantastic to talk about it, and I love the work you do. It's wonderful to talk to somebody who loves both law and film as much as I do.
Thanks again.